The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, its deep, resonant baritone echoing through the quiet of my home. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind of crisp, golden New England day where the leaves in my Boston suburb looked like they had been painted on the trees. I was sitting in my reading room, a cup of Earl Grey tea cooling on the side table, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice resting in my lap. This house, a beautifully preserved 3-story Victorian with wraparound porches and original mahogany woodwork, was my sanctuary. My late husband, Richard, and I had bought it 35 years ago when it was nothing more than a drafty, neglected shell. We spent decades pouring our love, our sweat, and our meager savings into restoring it. Every polished floorboard, every piece of crown molding held a memory of him. When Richard passed away from a sudden heart attack 7 years ago, the silence in the house had been deafening. But over time, that silence transformed from a suffocating grief into a comforting embrace. The house remembered him, and holding on to it meant holding on to the best years of my life. To the outside world, and more importantly to my son Thomas, I was simply Margaret, a 65-year-old retired high school librarian living modestly on a fixed pension and widow's benefits. I drove a reliable 2012 Buick LaCrosse. I clipped coupons for the grocery store. I wore sensible shoes and cardigan sweaters that I bought on sale at Macy's. That was the narrative I carefully maintained. It was safer that way. What Thomas didn't know, what nobody except my fiercely loyal attorney Arthur knew, was that behind the locked doors of Richard's old oak desk in the study, I was the sole owner of EL Properties. When Thomas was in middle school, I took a small inheritance from my maiden aunt and bought a rundown duplex. I fixed it up, rented it out, and used the equity to buy a small commercial storefront. Then another, and another. Over 30 years, while I played the role of the quiet, unassuming librarian, I had built a commercial real estate empire across Massachusetts. I owned strip malls, boutique hotel properties, and premium office spaces. My net worth was hovering somewhere around $8 million. I kept it a secret because I wanted my son to build his own character. I had seen too many children of wealth grow up entitled, lazy, and arrogant, waiting around for their parents to die so they could cash a check. I wanted Thomas to know the value of $1, the pride of a hard day's work. Looking back now, I realize how spectacularly my plan backfired. The crunch of tires on my gravel driveway shattered the afternoon quiet. I set my book down, peering through the lace curtains of the parlor window. A pristine charcoal gray Range Rover pulled to a stop near the front porch. The doors opened, and out stepped my son, Thomas, and his wife, Ashley. My chest tightened with that familiar, complicated knot of maternal love and quiet dread. Thomas, at 38, was a mid-level executive at a trendy tech firm in Silicon Valley, or so he constantly reminded anyone who would listen. He was dressed in his usual uniform, an expensive Patagonia vest over a crisp button-down, designer jeans, and pristine white sneakers that had never seen a speck of dirt. Ashley stepped out of the passenger side, her oversized Celine sunglasses covering half her face. She was 33, striking in a very manicured high-maintenance sort of way. Her blonde hair was perfectly blown out, and she held a tiny, shivering Pomeranian in one arm while aggressively tapping on her gold-cased iPhone with the other. Ashley's entire existence seemed to revolve around her Instagram aesthetic. She was a woman who measured her self-worth by the brands she wore and the envy she could harvest from her followers. I opened the heavy oak front door just as Thomas was struggling up the porch steps with 2 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases. Behind him, the back of the SUV was packed to the roof with designer luggage, garment bags, and cardboard boxes. "Thomas, Ashley, what a surprise," I said, trying to keep the alarm out of my voice. "Is everything all right?" "Mom!" Thomas panted, dropping the heavy bags onto my pristine Persian rug without a second thought. He leaned in for a quick, obligatory hug that smelled heavily of expensive cologne and stress. "Surprise. We're going to be staying with you for a little while." Ashley glided past me, her stiletto boots clicking sharply against the hardwood. She didn't offer a hug, barely offering a glance. "The house smells like old books and mothballs, Tommy," she complained, waving a manicured hand in front of her face. "I thought you said you had the air purifiers sent over." I bristled, closing the front door. "There are no mothballs in this house, Ashley. It's beeswax wood polish." "What do you mean you're staying for a little while? You live in California." Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, refusing to meet my eyes. It was a nervous tic he'd had since he was 7 years old and trying to lie about breaking a window. "Yeah, About that, we're actually relocating back to the East Coast. My company is opening a new hub in Boston, and they want me to head up the transition team. Huge promotion, Mom. Stock options, the whole 9 yards. That's wonderful news, Thomas, I said, my heart warming slightly despite the chaotic intrusion. But where will you live? Well, that's the thing, Ashley interjected, finally looking up from her phone. She looked around my grand foyer with thinly veiled distaste, as if inspecting a cheap motel room. We bought a gorgeous place in Brookline. Gut renovation. But the contractors are completely incompetent. They found black mold in the master suite, and the whole place has to be abated. It's totally unlivable for at least a few months. So we figured we'd just crash here. It's a win-win. We save on an Airbnb, and you get some company so you aren't rattling around in this creepy old museum all by yourself. A museum? That's what she called the home where my husband and I had built our lives. I see, I managed to say, swallowing the lump of indignation in my throat. I am a mother, and a mother's instinct is to open her doors when her child is in need, even when that child brings a storm with him. Of course you can stay. The guest room on the 2nd floor is always ready. Guest room? Ashley scoffed, her perfectly threaded eyebrows shooting up. Margaret, we have 40 boxes of wardrobe alone. We're going to need the master suite. You can take the guest room, right? Your knees are probably getting bad anyway. It's better if you're closer to the stairs. My master suite. The room I had shared with Richard for 3 decades. The bed where he had taken his last breath. I looked at Thomas, waiting for him to step in, to defend his mother, to set a boundary with his wife. Instead, he just gave me that pleading, exhausting look. Please, Mom. Ashley has chronic back pain. She needs the memory foam mattress. It's just for a few months until the Brookline house is done. I'll hire movers to shift your things. The betrayal stung, sharp and cold. But I had spent my life avoiding conflict, playing the role of the accommodating peacemaker. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was only temporary. Fine. I will move into the guest room. If I had known that conceding my bedroom was just the opening battle in a war for my dignity, I would have locked the front door right then and there. The invasion happened swiftly and mercilessly. Within 3 days, my quiet sanctuary was utterly unrecognizable. The sheer volume of their possessions was staggering. It wasn't just clothes. It was espresso machines that cost more than my first car, towering stacks of unread coffee table books meant only for display, and endless boxes of high-end skincare products that clutter every surface of the bathrooms. But the physical clutter was nothing compared to the suffocating weight of Ashley's entitlement. She treated my home like a bed and breakfast where she was the most demanding, dissatisfied VIP guest, and I was the unpaid, invisible staff. It started with small microaggressions. On their first Friday evening, I was in the kitchen preparing my famous pot roast, a recipe that took 4 hours to perfect and had been Thomas's absolute favorite growing up. I had spent all afternoon chopping root vegetables and searing the meat, looking forward to our first real family dinner. Ashley walked into the kitchen wearing silk pajamas at 4 in the afternoon. She wrinkled her nose, staring into my Le Creuset Dutch oven as if it contained toxic waste. "Margaret, what is that?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "It's Thomas's favorite pot roast," I smiled, wiping my hands on my apron. "I thought we could all sit down in the dining room tonight." "Oh, no, 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 no," she sighed, shaking her head. "Thomas and I are doing intermittent fasting, and we strictly adhere to a pescatarian keto-paleo hybrid diet right now. Red meat is basically poison. It causes severe cellular inflammation. Didn't Thomas tell you?" "He didn't mention it," I said, feeling my smile falter. "Thomas has always loved this dish." "Well, people evolve, Margaret. Or at least they should." She pulled open my refrigerator, shoving aside my Tupperware containers to make room for 4 massive overpriced glass bottles of pressed green juice she had postmated. "I ordered us some wild-caught salmon sashimi from that new fusion place downtown. We're just going to eat in our room while we watch Netflix. You can go ahead and freeze that stew." She turned and left the kitchen without a thank you, without a backward glance. I stood there, staring at the pot roast simmering on the stove, feeling a deep, profound ache in my chest. When Thomas came down an hour later to grab the sushi delivery, he saw me sitting alone at the kitchen island, eating a small bowl of the roast in silence. "Smells good, Mom," he muttered, avoiding my eyes. "I made it for you," I said softly. "I know. She's got a really sensitive gut right now because of the stress with the Brookline house. I gotta support her." He grabbed the paper bags and scurried back upstairs like a frightened child. He didn't even ask how my day was. That was the pattern. Thomas was an absolute ghost in the house. He claimed his new executive role required him to be on California time, meaning he was locked in the spare bedroom, which he had immediately claimed as his office, with his noise-canceling headphones on from noon until 9 at night. He emerged only to forage for food or to receive whatever packages Ashley had ordered that day. Ashley, on the other hand, was everywhere, and her mission seemed to be the systematic erasure of me from my own home. The following Tuesday, I came home from a morning of volunteering at the local library to find a massive heavy-duty trash bag sitting on the back porch. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a familiar blue and white porcelain handle poking through the plastic. I tore the bag open. Inside, haphazardly thrown together and chipped, was my entire collection of antique Delftware plates. Richard had bought them for me on our 10th anniversary during a trip to Amsterdam. They had hung on the wall of the dining room for 2 decades. Panic and fury rising in my throat, I stormed into the house. I found Ashley in the living room, instructing a hired handyman on where to hang a massive, hideous abstract painting that looked like someone had sneezed charcoal onto a canvas. The space on the wall where my plates had been was bare, the faded wallpaper a ghostly reminder of what had been stolen from me. "Ashley, what on earth are you doing?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Why are my anniversary plates in a garbage bag on the porch?" She turned slowly, looking me up and down with an expression of mild annoyance, as if a servant had interrupted her. "Oh, those old things? Margaret, they were completely ruining the feng shui of the room. They were so dated. I'm trying to curate a more modern, minimalist aesthetic for the house. It's much better for mental clarity. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you?" I gasped, stepping closer. "Those were a gift from my late husband. They are priceless to me. You had no right to touch them, let alone throw them away like garbage." Ashley rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her chest. "God, Margaret, why are boomers so emotionally attached to useless objects? It's just hoarding behavior. I'm trying to elevate this space. If you want to keep them, put them in the basement with the rest of your old junk." I was shaking. For a moment, I considered slapping her. I considered telling her to pack her bags and get out of my house. But then Thomas walked into the room, looking pale and exhausted, holding his laptop. "What's going on? I can hear you guys yelling from upstairs," he asked, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, your mother is having a meltdown because I took down some dusty old plates," Ashley said, immediately playing the victim. She leaned into Thomas, pouting. "I'm just trying to make this place feel a little more like home for us, Tommy. I'm so stressed out with the contractors, and your mother is being completely hostile." Thomas let out a long, heavy sigh. He looked at me, and once again chose the path of least resistance. "Mom, please, can you just let her have this? It's just plates. She's going through a lot right now with the move and the mold situation. We really need peace in this house." "It's just plates." I looked at the boy I had raised. I had worked double shifts when his father died to make sure he could go to a good college without debt. I had cheered at every soccer game, proofread every college essay, and loved him with every fiber of my being. And here he was, a grown man, allowing his spoiled wife to trample over his father's memory because he was too weak to stand up to her. "Fine," I whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of me. It wasn't worth it. I wasn't going to win against her manipulation and his cowardice. I walked out to the porch, gently retrieved my chipped plates from the garbage bag, and carried them down to the dark, damp basement, crying silent tears in the shadows. The disrespect escalated from there, transforming from careless entitlement to deliberate cruelty. By the 3rd week, my house was no longer mine. The thermostat was permanently set to a freezing 66 degrees because Ashley ran hot, forcing me to wear a winter coat indoors. My favorite lavender candles were thrown out because she claimed the artificial fragrance disrupted her endocrine system. She replaced them with $120 goop candles that smelled like burning sage and dirt. The final straw regarding my physical space happened on a rainy Thursday. I needed a book to escape the reality of my hijacked life. I walked down the hall toward my reading room, a small, cozy sanctuary at the back of the house with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a plush velvet armchair, and a fireplace. It was the only room I had explicitly asked them not to use. When I opened the door, I froze. The velvet armchair was gone. The antique Persian rug was rolled up in the corner, In the center of the room stood 4 massive industrial rolling clothing racks, groaning under the weight of hundreds of designer dresses, fur coats, and silk blouses. My bookshelves had been unceremoniously shoved aside to make room for towering stacks of designer shoeboxes. Ashley was sitting on a velvet stool in the middle of the room, a ring light set up in front of her phone. She was filming an Instagram story, speaking to her phone in that fake, breathy voice she reserved for her followers. So since our Brookline estate is undergoing a massive $1 million renovation, we're roughing it in this quaint little vintage house for a bit. I had to convert this dusty old study into a temporary walk-in closet just to survive. Link in my bio for this cashmere lounge set. She noticed me standing in the doorway and immediately paused the recording, dropping the sweet smile. "Do you mind, Margaret? I'm shooting sponsored content." "This is my reading room," I said, my voice dangerously low. "I specifically asked you to leave this space alone." "There wasn't enough closet space in the master suite," she replied flatly, returning to her phone to review the footage. "You have 1,000,000 books in here you've probably already read. Just go read in the living room. It's not a big deal." "It is a big deal, Ashley," I snapped, stepping into the room. "This is my home. You are a guest here. You do not have the right to dismantle my life room by room." She put her phone down, her eyes narrowing. The mask slipped completely, revealing the cold, calculating woman beneath. "Look, Margaret, let's be real here. Thomas is your only child. When you pass on, or let's be honest, when you have to move into an assisted living facility because these stairs are going to become too much for you, this house goes to him, which means it goes to us. I'm just getting a head start on modernizing an asset. Think of it as a favor. Now please close the door. I have a deadline for this brand deal." The sheer audacity of it left me speechless. She was already planning my death. She was already mentally spending my non-existent inheritance. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just turned around and walked away, the cold realization settling deep in my bones. They didn't view me as a mother or a human being with feelings. They viewed me as a landlord they didn't have to pay, a maid they could abuse, and an obstacle to an inheritance they felt entitled to. I retreated to my tiny guest room, locking the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the twin bed, staring blankly at the wall. For 3 weeks, I had endured the humiliation. I had swallowed my pride. I had played the submissive, accommodating mother because I loved my son and desperately wanted his marriage to work. I had been conditioned by society to believe that a good mother always sacrifices, always gives, always shrinks herself to make room for her children. But as I sat there, listening to the muffled sound of Ashley laughing into her phone down the hall, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud, explosive break. It was a quiet, profound shift. The grief and the hurt evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp, and intensely focused anger. I wasn't a victim. I was Margaret Hayes. I was a woman who had built an $8 million empire in absolute silence. I had negotiated with cutthroat commercial developers, navigated complex zoning laws, and outsmarted men in tailored suits who thought they could swindle a widow. I had a mind like a steel trap, and I was letting this vapid, narcissistic woman and my cowardly son treat me like a squatter in my own home. It was time to stop crying. It was time to start paying attention. The opportunity presented itself the very next morning. It was Friday, around 10 a.m. Ashley had left the house in her Range Rover, announcing she had an emergency appointment with her colorist in the city that would take 6 hours. Thomas was, as usual, locked in the spare bedroom, supposedly running an executive meeting. I went into the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea. The kitchen island was a mess of Ashley's unwashed smoothie blenders and Thomas's junk mail. As I was wiping down the granite counter, my rag caught the edge of a stack of envelopes Thomas had brought in the day before and tossed aside. The stack slid off the counter, scattering across the hardwood floor. I knelt down to pick them up. Most of it was junk, catalogs, credit card offers. But one envelope caught my eye. It was thick, stark white, and bore the official seal of a prominent California law firm. It was addressed to Thomas, but the words printed in bold red ink across the bottom of the envelope made my blood run cold. Final notice. Foreclosure proceedings. My hands trembled as I held the envelope. Foreclosure? But they had sold their California house to buy the Brookline property. They had equity. They had Thomas's massive tech salary. The envelope wasn't fully sealed. The flap had caught on something and was half open. the privacy laws of mail, the boundaries of a mother prying into her adult son's life. None of it mattered in that moment. I pulled the document out. It was a legal notice from a bank. It stated that due to 12 months of non-payment, the bank had successfully executed a foreclosure on their property in San Jose, California. The property had been auctioned off 3 weeks ago to satisfy a debt of over $1.5 million. They had been officially evicted. They didn't sell their house. They lost it. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked toward the stairs, listening to the silence of the house. I needed more information. If they were lying about the house, what else were they lying about? I walked quietly up the stairs and approached the spare bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. Thomas wasn't on a conference call. He was lying on the air mattress they had set up in the corner, fully dressed, fast asleep, his mouth hanging open. His laptop sat open and glowing on the makeshift desk near the window. I shouldn't have done it. But the instinct for survival had kicked in. I slipped into the room, my footsteps silent on the carpet. I stood in front of the laptop. The screen wasn't locked. He wasn't running a spreadsheet or a team meeting. He had a browser open with 20 tabs. Most of them were LinkedIn job boards, Indeed listings, and aggressive emails to corporate recruiters. I glanced at his inbox. At the very top was an email from a recruiter, dated that morning. Thomas, following up on our call. Unfortunately, the firm is passing on your candidacy. Given that you were terminated for cause from Zenith Tech 8 months ago, clients are hesitant. Terminated, 8 months ago. I felt the air leave my lungs. I reached out, my finger hovering over the trackpad, and scrolled down his inbox. It was a graveyard of financial ruin. Overdue notices from American Express. Final warnings from auto loan lenders for the leased Range Rover. Threats from collection agencies. There was no gut renovation in Brookline. There was no promotion. There was no new hub in Boston. It was all a lie. A massive, spectacular, desperate illusion. My son wasn't a high-powered tech executive relocating for a promotion. He was an unemployed, bankrupt fraud who had dragged his debt-ridden, label-obsessed wife across the country to hide out in his mother's house because they literally had nowhere else to go. They were completely broke. And yet, for the last 3 weeks, they had been ordering expensive sushi, buying $100 candles, discarding my priceless antiques, and treating me like a peasant, all while completely destitute. They were living in a fantasy world, and they expected me to subsidize their delusion while accepting their abuse. I slowly backed away from the laptop. I walked out of the room, gently pulling the door shut behind me. I descended the stairs, gripping the mahogany banister to steady myself. The anger I had felt the night before was nothing compared to the icy, terrifying clarity that possessed me now. Thomas and Ashley thought they were playing a game with a naive, technologically illiterate old widow. They thought they could manipulate me, occupy my home, and slowly push me out of the picture to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I walked into my study, bypassing the mess of clothing racks Ashley had erected. I went straight to the old oak desk in the corner. I reached under the rim, found the hidden lever, and popped open the concealed drawer. Inside was a burner phone I used exclusively for my real estate business, and a thick leather-bound ledger. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice. "Arthur," I said, my voice steady, devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "Margaret?" My lawyer's gruff voice came through the receiver, sounding surprised. "It's been a while. Is everything all right? You sound different." "Everything is perfectly fine, Arthur," I replied, staring out the window at the sprawling lawn I had meticulously maintained for 30 years. "But it's time to do a full audit of the books, and I need you to run a deep, comprehensive financial background check on Thomas and his wife. I want to know every cent they owe, every creditor they are dodging, and exactly how deep this hole goes." "Thomas? Your son? Margaret, what's going on?" "What's going on?" I said softly, a grim smile finally touching my lips, "is that the guests have overstayed their welcome, and it's time to start preparing the eviction." I hung up the phone. The game had changed, and it was my turn to play. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in psychological endurance. Knowing the truth about their financial ruin changed everything. It was like watching a play where I was the only one in the audience who knew the actors were ad-libbing their lines while the theater was burning down around them. The sheer audacity of their charade was staggering. Here was my son, a man secretly drowning in debt, fielding calls from collection agencies in the spare bedroom while pretending to be on executive conference calls. And here was his wife, a woman whose home had been foreclosed on by a bank, having the nerve to hand me a pile of her wrinkled, dry-clean-only silk blouses on a Tuesday morning. "Margaret, these need to be pressed before the weekend," Ashley had said, dropping the bundle onto the kitchen island where I was drinking my morning coffee. "And please, use the low heat setting this time. I can't afford to have you scorch another Alice plus Olivia top." I had looked at the silk blouses, then at the mountain of Amazon Prime and Net-a-Porter boxes piled by the front door, purchases made with maxed-out credit cards she had no intention of paying. I simply took a sip of my coffee, pushed the blouses back toward her, and said, "I believe the dry cleaner on Elm Street opens at 9, Ashley. I am not your maid." She had blinked, clearly taken aback by my sudden refusal to play the accommodating mother-in-law, before snatching the blouses with an exaggerated huff and storming off. It was a small victory, but the real test of my restraint came 3 days later. It was a Thursday afternoon. I had driven my old Buick across town to pick up some groceries, relishing the quiet peace of my own company. When I turned onto my street, my stomach plummeted. A massive yellow landscaping backhoe was parked on my front lawn, its deep treads tearing into the meticulously manicured grass. A crew of 4 men in high-visibility vests were hauling heavy wooden planks and rolls of artificial turf toward the side of the house. I threw the Buick into park, leaving the keys in the ignition, and sprinted toward the backyard. Nothing could have prepared me for the sight. My rose garden, the beautiful, sprawling sanctuary of heirloom David Austin roses that Richard and I had planted the spring after Thomas was born, was gone. The earth had been brutally torn open. The wooden memorial bench with Richard's name carved into it had been shoved carelessly against the fence, its legs splintered. The delicate pink and yellow bushes that I had pruned, fertilized, and loved for over 30 years had been ripped out by the roots and tossed into a massive dumpster like common weeds. Standing in the center of the destruction, pointing a manicured finger and holding a clipboard, was Ashley. She was wearing designer athleisure wear and a wide-brimmed sun hat, chatting animatedly with the landscaping foreman. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice cracking with a grief so sharp it felt like a physical blow. "Stop this right now. What have you done?" The workers paused, looking uncomfortably between me and Ashley. Ashley sighed, rolling her eyes beneath her oversized sunglasses, and walked over to me, annoyed that I was interrupting her project. "Margaret, please don't be dramatic," she said, lowering her voice as if dealing with a toddler throwing a tantrum. "I'm hosting a high-level networking mixer this Saturday. A lot of very important tech investors and local influencers are coming. We are renting a luxury party tent, and we needed a flat surface for the caterers and the temporary flooring. Those overgrown thorny bushes were taking up half the yard." "Those overgrown bushes," I choked out, my hands shaking so violently I had to clench them into fists, "were planted by my husband. That was his memorial garden. You had absolutely no right to touch my property." "Oh, for heaven's sake," Ashley scoffed, placing a hand on her hip. "It's just some dirt and old flowers. I'm trying to elevate this property. You really need to let go of the past, Margaret. Besides, let's be realistic here. This house is practically Tommy's asset anyway. We're just maximizing its potential. Now please, go back inside. You're embarrassing us in front of the contractors." I looked past her. Standing on the back porch, holding a cup of coffee and watching the entire exchange, was Thomas. He saw the destroyed garden. He saw the splintered memorial bench of the father who had worshipped him. He saw the tears of sheer devastation streaming down my face. For a split second, our eyes met. I waited for the son I had raised to step forward. I waited for him to tell his wife she had crossed an unforgivable line, to demand the workers leave, to come down and hold his mother. Instead, Thomas swallowed hard, looked away, and quietly stepped back into the house, sliding the glass door shut behind him. In that exact moment, whatever lingering maternal softness I had left for my son died. It withered up and blew away like the crushed rose petals under the backhoe's tires. I didn't cry anymore. The emotional detachment was sudden, total, and absolute. I looked at Ashley, who was tapping her foot impatiently. "You will regret this," I said, my voice eerily calm and devoid of all warmth. I turned and walked back into the house. I didn't say another word to either of them for the rest of the week. I stayed in my small guest room, methodically plotting my next move, waiting for them to make theirs. I didn't have to wait long. 2 nights after the infamous networking mixer, a pathetic, catered charade funded by phantom money to impress people who didn't care about them, Thomas knocked on my bedroom door. He entered with a sheepish, practiced smile, holding a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. "Hey, Mom," he said softly, sitting on the edge of the mattress. "I know tensions have been a little high lately with the yard, and I'm sorry about that. Ashley just gets carried away with her projects. But I wanted to talk to you about something important. For your future." "My future," I repeated, keeping my face perfectly neutral. "How thoughtful of you, Thomas. What is it?" He pulled a dense stack of heavily stapled documents from the envelope. "I've been talking to a wealth management guy in my network. He was looking over some public records and noticed you don't have your assets properly shielded. Mom, if something were to happen to you, the government would take a massive chunk of this house in probate taxes. It could be tied up in court for years." He handed me a sleek silver pen. "This is a living trust. It's a standard estate planning tool. If you sign this, it transfers the title of the house into the trust, with me listed as the primary trustee. It doesn't change anything for you now, but it protects the house from taxes and creditors later. It's just the responsible thing to do." He looked at me with those wide, earnest eyes, the same look he used to give me when he swore he hadn't broken a vase in the living room. "A living trust," I mused, taking the heavy stack of papers. "That sounds very complicated, Thomas. Let me go get my reading glasses." "Oh, you don't really need to read all the boilerplate jargon, Mom," he said quickly, a flash of panic crossing his features. "It's standard legal speak. Just sign on the yellow sticky tabs." "A smart woman always reads what she signs, Thomas," I replied smoothly, standing up and retrieving my glasses from the dresser. I sat back down and began flipping through the pages. Most of it was indeed standard boilerplate language for a revocable living trust. But Thomas was underestimating me. Over 30 years of running commercial real estate, I had read thousands of contracts. I knew exactly what to look for, and more importantly, where lawyers hid the poison pills. I found it buried on a page 27, sandwiched between clauses about asset distribution. It wasn't just a living trust. Tucked neatly into the document was an incredibly broad, durable power of attorney granting Thomas complete financial control over my estate. And right behind it was the real prize, a pre-filled application for a home equity line of credit, HELOC. He was trying to trick me into giving him the legal authority to borrow $250,000 against the equity of my home, the home I had paid off 20 years ago. He was going to put a lien on my sanctuary to pay off his secret debts, and he was smiling at me while he did it. A cold fury settled in my chest, steady and sharp. "Could you be a dear and fetch me a glass of water, Thomas?" I asked, looking up at him innocently. "My throat is terribly dry." "Sure, Mom. Be right back." He practically leaped off the bed, eager to keep me comfortable and compliant. The moment his footsteps disappeared down the stairs, I moved with lightning speed. I carefully ripped the HELOC application page out of the stack, folded it in half, and shoved it deep into the pocket of my cardigan. When Thomas returned with the water, I was waiting with the pen in hand. "It all looks very official," I smiled, taking the glass. "Where do I sign?" He eagerly pointed to the yellow tabs. I leaned over the document and pressed the pen to the paper. But I didn't sign Margaret Ann Hayes. I deliberately, carefully signed Margaret Annabelle Haynes, curving the letters just enough to make it look legitimate at a glance, but ensuring that any notary or bank official matching it to my legal ID would flag it as a fraudulent, mismatched signature. The document was legally useless. "There," I said, handing the stack back to him. "Protected." Thomas exhaled a long, shaky breath of pure relief. He clutched the papers to his chest like a winning lottery ticket. "Thanks, Mom. You're doing the right thing. I'll drop these off with my guy tomorrow." "I'm sure you will," I whispered as he hurried out of the room. The next morning, while Thomas and Ashley were sleeping in, I took my Buick and drove into the city. I didn't go to the library or the grocery store. I drove to a sleek, glass-fronted high-rise in the financial district, a building where I happened to own the entire top-floor lease. I bypassed the receptionist and walked directly into the corner office of my attorney, Arthur. Arthur was a silver-haired, formidable man who had been my late husband's best friend and my fiercest confidant for 3 decades. He was sitting at his grand mahogany desk, a thick dossier resting in the center. "Margaret," he said, standing up and pulling out a chair for me. His expression was incredibly grim. "I've been doing this job for 40 years, and this is one of the ugliest I've ever put together." I sat down, placing my handbag on the floor. Give it to me straight, Arthur. No sugarcoating. Arthur opened the folder, adjusting his glasses. The foreclosure on their California home and the maxed-out credit cards are just the tip of the iceberg. Your son didn't just get caught up in tech industry layoffs. He was terminated for cause. What kind of cause? Arthur looked me dead in the eye. Embezzlement. Thomas misappropriated $50,000 from his company's operational budget to cover Ashley's skyrocketing lifestyle expenses. The company caught him. The room seemed to tilt. My son was a thief. Why isn't he in prison? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Because of Ashley's parents, Arthur explained, pulling out a copy of a wired transaction. The in-laws, the Vanderbilts, they are obsessed with their social standing. When the company threatened to press criminal charges, Ashley's father panicked. He paid the tech firm the $50,000 out of his own pocket in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement. They quietly fired Thomas, and no charges were filed. Arthur leaned forward, folding his hands. But Ashley's father isn't a generous man. He's ruthless. According to the private investigator I hired, the Vanderbilts are currently extorting Thomas. They gave him an ultimatum. Pay back the $50,000 with exorbitant interest by the end of the year, or they will take the NDA to the police themselves and see Thomas thrown in federal prison. That's why they fled to Boston. That's why he's trying to steal the equity out of your house. He's cornered by his own in-laws. I sat in the quiet of the office, letting the weight of the betrayal wash over me. My son had stolen. His wife's parents had covered it up, and now they were holding a gun to his head, forcing him to rob his own mother to save his skin. They thought they had outsmarted everyone. They thought Margaret Hayes was just a frail, ignorant widow they could easily discard to clean up their mess. I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out the crumpled HELOC application Thomas had tried to sneak past me, and placed it on Arthur's desk. He tried to execute a $250,000 lien against my home last night, I said coolly. I sabotaged the signature so it will bounce back, but it proves intent. Arthur looked at the paper, his jaw tightening. Margaret, I can have the police at your house in 20 minutes. We have him on attempted fraud. We can throw them both out today. No, I said, leaning back in my leather chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. Kicking them out is too easy. If I kick them out, they'll just keep running, keep lying, keep destroying things. Then what do you want to do? Arthur asked, recognizing the tone in my voice, the tone of the businesswoman who had ruthlessly built an empire. Ashley's parents hold the debt that's making my son desperate, I said, my mind working 10 steps ahead. I want to use my holding company, EL Properties. I want you to contact the Vanderbilts anonymously. Offer to buy Thomas's debt off them at a premium, full cash, immediately. They are greedy, pretentious people. They won't turn down cold, hard cash. Arthur's eyes widened as he realized what I was planning. Margaret, if you buy that debt, you become the primary creditor. You will legally own your son. Exactly, I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt. It's time to teach Thomas and Ashley a lesson about real wealth, real power, and the terrifying consequences of crossing a mother who has nothing left to lose. The following 3 weeks were an exercise in supreme calculated patience. While Thomas and Ashley continued to treat my home like a luxury hotel where the staff was perpetually underperforming, Arthur went to work. Using my corporate shield, EL Properties, Arthur approached Richard Vanderbilt, Ashley's pompous, status-obsessed father. The premise was simple and entirely legal. EL Properties posed as a private debt acquisition firm interested in purchasing distressed, high-yield personal liabilities. Arthur offered Richard a staggering deal. We would buy the $50,000 debt Thomas owed him for $60,000, wired immediately into his account in exchange for the original promissory note and the non-disclosure agreement from the tech company. Richard Vanderbilt was a man who worshipped money above all else. He didn't care who was buying the debt or why. He just saw a $10,000 profit and a quick, quiet exit from his son-in-law's mess. Within 48 hours, the wire transfer cleared. The original documents bearing my son's signature and the damning details of his corporate theft were delivered to Arthur's office via armed courier. I now legally owned my son's darkest secret. And by extension, I owned him. I said nothing. I continued to make my morning tea. I continued to smile pleasantly when Ashley complained that the thread count on her sheets was irritating her skin. I was waiting for this perfect stage to drop the curtain on their spectacular charade. That stage, fittingly, was Thanksgiving. Ashley had insisted on hosting her parents at my house, casually mentioning that her mother, Eleanor, was dying to see the vintage charm of the place before we remodel the main floor. I knew exactly what that meant. They were coming to inspect the spoils of the war they thought they had already won. Thanksgiving Day arrived gray and biting, with a sharp wind whipping off the Massachusetts Bay. I spent the entire morning in the kitchen. For once, Ashley didn't interfere. She was too busy in the upstairs bathroom, applying a face full of makeup and barking orders at Thomas to make sure the imported wine was decanting properly. I roasted a 20-pound heritage turkey, made my grandmother's cornbread stuffing, and prepared a lattice-top cherry pie from scratch. I wanted the house to smell like the perfect traditional American home. The contrast between the warmth of the food and the ice in my veins was absolute. At 3 o'clock, a sleek black Mercedes S-Class pulled into the driveway, carefully avoiding the tire ruts left by the backhoe that had destroyed my rose garden. Richard and Eleanor Vanderbilt stepped out. They were a matching set of aggressive, new-money arrogance. Richard wore a custom-tailored suit that was just a shade too tight, and a gold Rolex that he made sure caught the light when he gestured. Eleanor was draped in a mink coat, her face pulled taut by the best plastic surgeons in Beverly Hills, exuding a sharp, brittle energy. I opened the door and offered a polite, practiced smile. "Richard, Eleanor, welcome to my home." Eleanor didn't offer to take her shoes off. She stepped past me, her heels clicking loudly on the foyer tiles, her eyes darting around the space, assessing its market value. "Margaret, how quaint. It has such good bones. Of course, the wallpaper is tragic, but nothing a good demolition crew couldn't fix." "We're looking forward to modernizing it," Ashley chimed in, appearing at the top of the stairs and descending like royalty. She kissed her mother on both cheeks. "Wait until you see the plans Tommy and I have for the kitchen." Thomas trailed behind her, looking distinctly nauseous. The stress of his impending deadline with Richard was eating him alive. He shook his father-in-law's hand, his own trembling slightly. "Good to see you, son," Richard said, slapping Thomas on the back with a little too much force. "Let's hope you've got some good news to share today. A man's patience only lasts so long, right?" The threat was thinly veiled, hanging in the air like poison. Thomas swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir. We're finalizing the paperwork this week." "Excellent," Richard beamed, turning his predatory gaze to me. "You know, Margaret, we were just looking at a brochure for a lovely assisted living community down in Boca Raton. Top-tier medical staff, bingo nights. You really shouldn't be managing all these stairs at your age. Once Thomas takes over the estate, you should seriously consider it. We'd hate to see you take a bad fall when no one is around." They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. They were measuring the drapes while the owner was still in the room. "Dinner is served," I said smoothly, gesturing toward the dining room. The dining table was set to perfection with my heavy crystal goblets and the good silver Richard had polished for our first anniversary. We took our seats. Thomas sat at the opposite end of the table from me, avoiding my gaze entirely. Ashley and her parents sat along the sides, dominating the conversation with loud, boastful stories about their recent yacht charter in Mykonos. As I carved the turkey, passing the heavy porcelain platters around, Richard Vanderbilt tapped his crystal water glass with his heavy silver fork. The sharp clink, clink, clink silenced the table. "I'd like to propose a toast," Richard announced, standing up and raising his glass of Bordeaux. He looked at Thomas, then condescendingly down at me. "To family, and to progress. It's not easy for the older generation to step aside and let the young blood take the reins. But Margaret, we commend you for finally seeing reason and preparing to sign this magnificent property over to Thomas. It takes a big woman to know when she's become a burden. To the future of this house." "To the future," Ashley echoed, a smug, victorious smile plastered on her face. Thomas raised his glass, his hand shaking so badly the dark red wine sloshed over the rim, staining the pristine white linen tablecloth like a drop of blood. I didn't raise my glass. I placed my carving knife down on the silver platter. The metallic clatter echoed loudly in the sudden quiet of the room. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my wool skirt. I looked at the four of them, the thieves, the liars, and the cowards who had invaded my sanctuary. "I think," I said, my voice cutting through the warm, savory air of the dining room like a blade of ice, "that before we drink to the future, we should have an honest conversation about the present." I reached into the pocket of my cardigan, pulled out a small brass key, and casually locked the heavy sliding parlor doors that separated the dining room from the foyer. Then I turned toward the solid oak door that led to my private library. I knocked twice. The door opened. Arthur stepped into the dining room. He wasn't dressed for a holiday dinner. He was wearing his dark, pinstriped courtroom suit, carrying a thick, scuffed leather briefcase. The smug smiles vanished from the Vanderbilts' faces. Ashley frowned, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Mom," Thomas squeaked, his voice cracking. "What is going on? Who is this?" "This is Arthur Pendleton," I replied, gesturing for Arthur to take the empty chair at my right. "He was your father's best friend, and for the last 30 years he has been my corporate attorney and wealth manager." "Wealth manager?" Eleanor scoffed, her Botoxed forehead struggling to wrinkle. "Margaret, you live on a teacher's pension. Don't be ridiculous." Arthur unlatched his briefcase with a loud, satisfying snap. He pulled out 4 identical, thick, spiral-bound dossiers and slid one across the polished mahogany table to each of them. "I suggest you open them," Arthur said, his voice gravelly and devoid of amusement. Richard Vanderbilt snatched his copy, flipping it open. Ashley and Thomas leaned over theirs. "Page 1, I narrated calmly, pacing slowly behind my chair. "A summary of EL Properties, a commercial real estate holding company founded 30 years ago. If you turn to page 3, you will see a list of the assets currently owned outright by that company. 3 strip malls in the greater Boston area, 2 boutique hotels, a corporate high-rise in the financial district, and this house." I stopped pacing and rested my hands on the back of my chair, locking eyes with my son. "The sole proprietor, CEO, and 100% shareholder of EL Properties is Margaret Ann Hayes. My net worth, as of this morning's valuation, is $8.4 million. The silence in the dining room was absolute, thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fireplace. Ashley's face drained of all color. Her jaw literally dropped, her eyes darting frantically from the financial statements to my face, realizing the woman she had treated like a peasant could buy and sell her entire life 10 times over. "Wait," Thomas stammered, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning terror. "Mom, you're a millionaire? But the Buick, the coupons—" "I clip coupons because I respect the value of $1, Thomas," I said sharply, the anger finally bleeding into my voice. "A concept you clearly never grasped. Turn to page 12. They scrambled to turn the pages. On page 12, you will find a copy of an email from the HR department at Zenith Tech. It details Thomas's termination for cause 8 months ago. Next to it is a notice of foreclosure from a California bank, finalizing the seizure of your home 3 weeks ago. There is no promotion. There is no Brookline estate undergoing renovations. You are both unemployed, bankrupt, and drowning in $500,000 of consumer debt." "Tommy!" Ashley shrieked, turning on her husband like a rabid dog. "You told me the Brookline house was delayed. You told me you had severance. And you," I snapped, pointing a finger at Ashley, stopping her theatrics dead in their tracks. "You knew the California house was gone? Don't play the victim. You both dragged your mountain of lies into my home, disrespected my husband's memory, destroyed his garden, and treated me like a senile maid." Richard Vanderbilt slammed his fist on the table, the silverware rattling. His face was purple with rage, but not at me, at Thomas. "You worthless piece of garbage!" Richard roared at my son. "You lied to us. You told me you had the money to pay me back today. You owe me $50,000, you little thief, and if I don't see it by tomorrow, I am taking that NDA straight to the district attorney. You're going to federal prison." Thomas shrank back in his chair, putting his hands up in a pathetic attempt to shield himself. "Richard, please, I just need a little more time. My guy is pushing the HELOC through." "He isn't pushing anything through," I interrupted, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled home equity line of credit application. I tossed it onto the center of the table, right next to the carved turkey. "I saw the trap, Thomas," I whispered, the heartbreak of a mother finally mingling with the ruthlessness of a CEO. I purposefully invalidated the signature. You tried to forge a lien against the only home I have ever loved to save your own skin. "Mom, I was desperate," Thomas cried, real tears finally spilling down his cheeks. "Richard was going to ruin me. I was going to pay you back, I swear." "Shut up," Richard Vanderbilt barked, standing up and pointing a furious finger at Thomas. "We are done here. Eleanor, get your coat. I'm calling the police right now. I'm handing over the embezzlement file." He reached into his breast pocket for his phone. "You can't do that, Richard," Arthur said smoothly from his chair, not even blinking. Richard stopped, glaring at the lawyer. "Watch me." He stole from his company. "I have the promissory note and the NDA." "Actually, you don't," I smiled, a cold, feral expression that made Eleanor Vanderbilt physically recoil. "Turn to the final page in the dossier, Richard." Frowning, Richard flipped to the back of the binder. He stared at the document, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. The blood slowly drained from his flushed face as comprehension dawned. 3 weeks ago, I explained, leaning over the table, EL Properties bought a distressed $50,000 debt from a private seller named Richard Vanderbilt. We paid a 20% premium for it. Cash. I locked eyes with Ashley's father. "You sold his debt. You signed over the original promissory note and the NDA. You no longer possess any legal standing to extort my son or report him to anyone. You are entirely irrelevant to this equation." Richard stood frozen, his phone dangling uselessly in his hand. He had been completely outplayed by the quaint widow in the cardigan. "You have 5 minutes to leave my house," I told the Vanderbilts, my voice cracking like a whip. "If you are not off my property by the time the grandfather clock chimes the half hour, Arthur will have you arrested for trespassing." Eleanor didn't say a word. Ta del. She grabbed her mink coat, seized her husband by the arm, and practically dragged him toward the front door. I unlocked it for them, and they vanished into the freezing November night without looking back. The heavy front door clicked shut. I turned back to the dining room. Thomas and Ashley were sitting exactly where I had left them. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to a piece of driftwood, shivering and terrified. The arrogant tech executive and the Instagram influencer were gone. In their place sat 2 broke, desperate frauds facing the terrifying reality of their actions. "Mom!" Thomas sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, I don't want to go to jail. Please don't give the file to the police." Ashley was hyperventilating quietly, her mascara running down her perfectly contoured cheeks in thick black tracks. I walked over and sat down at the head of the table. I looked at the son I had birthed, the boy I had loved so fiercely. It hurt to look at him. It felt like mourning a death, but the mother who would have sacrificed herself to save him had been buried under the treads of that backhoe in the rose garden. "I am not sending you to prison, Thomas," I said softly. He looked up, a desperate, pathetic flare of hope in his eyes. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you. I'll change, I swear. I'll find a new job. I'll pay you back every cent." "You will," Arthur interjected, sliding 2 fresh, crisp contracts across the table. One in front of Thomas, one in front of Ashley. "But you won't be finding a new job. Margaret has already found one for you." They stared at the contracts. "You currently owe EL Properties $60,000 for the buyout of your embezzlement debt," I stated, tapping the paper. "In addition, I am billing you $40,000 for the emotional distress and physical destruction of my late husband's memorial garden. You owe me $100,000. I leaned forward. "You have 24 hours to pack your 40 boxes of designer garbage and vacate my home. You will move into a small 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in South Boston that EL Properties owns. Rent will be deducted automatically from your paychecks." "Paychecks?" Ashley whispered, her voice trembling. "For what?" "For your new jobs," I smiled. "I own a strip mall out on Route 1. It's seen better days. The parking lot needs constant trash removal. The public restrooms need daily scrubbing, and the roof leaks. Thomas, you are the new lead maintenance technician. Ashley, you are the assistant janitor. You will work 40 hours a week at minimum wage. 50% of your wages will be garnished to pay off the $100,000 you owe me. The rest you will use to survive." Thomas stared at me in absolute horror. "Mom, I'm a tech executive. I can't scrub toilets. I can't." "You aren't an executive, Thomas. You're a thief," I corrected him coldly. "And this is the only offer on the table. You sign these employment contracts right now, and you show up for your shift at 6 a.m. on Monday in a uniform. If you refuse or if you quit, Arthur will hand the embezzlement file to the district attorney tomorrow morning, and you will serve 3 to 5 years in a federal penitentiary." I looked at Ashley, who was shaking her head in violent denial. "And Ashley, you are a co-conspirator. You sign or you can go back to your parents, who I'm sure will welcome you with open arms now that you have absolutely nothing." The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. They looked at each other. There was no love in their eyes, only the shared, terrifying realization that they were trapped in a cage of their own making. Slowly, with trembling hands, Thomas picked up the pen. He signed the contract. A moment later, crying silently, Ashley did the same. "Good," I said, standing up. "Arthur will show you out. You have until tomorrow at sunset to be gone. Leave the keys on the counter." 6 months later, the New England spring had finally thawed the frozen ground. I sat in the driver's seat of a brand-new charcoal gray Lexus SUV, parked inconspicuously at the far edge of the Route 1 strip mall. I sipped a hot coffee, watching the scene unfold in front of the discount grocery store. Thomas was wearing a heavy gray canvas jumpsuit, his name stitched onto a patch on his chest. He was wrestling a massive leaking garbage bag out of a public trash can, his face smeared with grime and sweat. A few feet away, Ashley was wearing a matching uniform, her hair tied back in a messy knot, fiercely scrubbing graffiti off the brick wall with a wire brush and a bucket of soapy water. There were no designer sunglasses, no luxury SUVs, no Instagram stories, just the grueling, honest labor they had spent their entire adult lives trying to avoid. Arthur's report said they were miserable, but they hadn't missed a single shift. They were too terrified of prison to run. For the first time in his life, Thomas was actually earning the money he was spending. And maybe, in 10 years when the debt was paid, they would emerge as decent human beings. I didn't stay long. I put the Lexus in drive and headed back toward the suburbs. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked beautiful in the morning sun. I walked around to the backyard. The ugly patch of dirt where the backhoe had torn up the earth was gone. In its place, freshly turned soil held a dozen new, vibrant David Austin rose bushes, their pink and yellow buds just beginning to open to the sky. I sat down on the newly carved wooden bench. I closed my eyes, breathed in the sweet scent of the blooming flowers, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt absolute, unshakable peace. This was my home, and nobody would ever make me feel like a guest in it again.